In the wake of Sultan Bayezid I's catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Ankara in 1402 and his subsequent capture by Timur, the Ottoman Empire fell into disarray. Once considered a rising imperial force, the Ottomans now appeared on the brink of collapse. The power vacuum left by Bayezid's imprisonment led to a brutal and drawn-out civil war between his sons, a period remembered as the Ottoman Interregnum. This dark chapter fractured the empire's unity, destabilized its provinces, and encouraged foreign enemies to strike at its borders. However, amid the bloodshed and chaos, a glimmer of hope gradually emerged through the cunning and resilience of one prince, Mehmed Çelebi, who would later be known as Mehmed I, while his brothers Süleyman, Isa, and Musa grappled for supremacy by launching attacks, forming alliances, and betraying one another. Mehmed took a different path. Rather than rushing headfirst into open confrontation, he focused on consolidating power in eastern Anatolia, building support among local leaders, religious scholars, and the remnants of loyal military units. His restraint, patience, and foresight marked a sharp contrast to the reckless ambition of his rivals. He understood that the road to restoration would not be paved through brute force alone, but through strategic diplomacy, thoughtful leadership, and calculated military moves. During this period, the empire had effectively split into competing zones of influence. Süleyman, with his stronghold in Edirne and support from the Janissaries and some European powers, controlled parts of the Balkans and western Thrace. Isa briefly held sway in Bursa but lacked strong alliances and was quickly outmaneuvered. Musa, who started as a lesser player, became a major force after defeating Süleyman with Mehmed's temporary support, only to later turn against Mehmed himself. This era saw shifting loyalties, betrayals, and regional instability that wore down the Ottoman infrastructure. Yet, through it all, Mehmed continued to methodically expand his control over Anatolian territories. He secured loyalty through fair governance, respected the ulema, and carefully rebuilt his forces, laying the groundwork for a unified response once the time was right. The people, exhausted by war and yearning for stability, began to view Mehmed as the most promising candidate to restore peace and legitimacy. After eliminating Isa and withdrawing support from Musa, once his ambitions became dangerous, Mehmed ultimately confronted his last rival in 1413 in a decisive battle near Kamerlu. With Musa's defeat and death, Mehmed declared himself the sole ruler of the Ottoman Empire, marking the official end of the Interregnum. But the task of rebuilding the empire had only just begun. Mehmed I inherited a fragmented realm still reeling from years of war. Provinces were either independent, disloyal, or controlled by opportunistic warlords. Trade had collapsed, tax systems were in disrepair, and many cities lay in ruin. However, Mehmed wasted no time. Understanding the gravity of the moment, he set out to heal the wounds of disunity by restoring institutions, rewarding loyalty, and reaching out to former enemies with reconciliation. He presented himself not as a conquering warlord, but as a unifier sent to restore the empire's rightful balance. His first priority was administrative reform. He appointed trusted officials to key provincial roles, replacing corrupt or disloyal governors who had taken advantage of the chaos. He focused on economic recovery by reviving trade routes and encouraging merchants to return to their cities. Markets reopened, caravan routes were secured, and cities like Bursa, Edirne, and Amasya began to show signs of renewal. He also focused on strengthening the military not for expansion, but for defense and stability. The Janissaries, who had been manipulated by different princes during the Interregnum, were brought back under strict state control. Land grants and salaries were restored to Sepahists to secure their loyalty. At the same time, Mehmed sought to mend the spiritual fabric of the empire. By working closely with religious leaders and Sufi orders, He re-established religious legitimacy that had been tarnished by years of dynastic warfare. His alignment with the ulama helped calm public sentiment, while his support for charitable works and madrasas created a sense of moral order. He also began the careful work of repairing Ottoman relations with external powers. He reached out to the Byzantines, Venetians, and Balkan lords not as an aggressor but as a stabilizer. Through treaties and gestures of goodwill, he reduced immediate threats to the empire's borders, buying time for internal reconstruction. His actions helped restore Ottoman credibility in the eyes of both allies and enemies. Despite his relatively short reign, Mehmed I's leadership proved to be the bridge between collapse and revival. He did not engage in grand conquest, nor did he expand the empire's borders significantly. Yet, what he achieved was arguably more valuable. He restored the heart of an empire that had nearly bled to death. Under his rule, law returned to the streets, trade returned to the markets, and hope returned to the people. His vision, discipline, and humility set an example for future sultans, showing that wisdom and restraint could be as powerful as military strength. As the empire slowly recovered under his steady hand, the foundations were laid for future greatness. When Mehmed died in 1421, he left behind a stable, functional empire that his son Murad II would take forward. In many ways, the legacy of Mehmed I was not measured in territory or titles, but in the survival of the Ottoman state itself. He proved that even after a near-fatal collapse, with vision and patience, a shattered empire could rise again, not just to survive, but to flourish in the chapters yet to be written. As Mehmed I assumed complete control of the Ottoman Empire in 1413, following the death of his last rival brother Musa, he faced a landscape both physically and politically devastated. The empire had endured a decade of internal warfare that left cities in ruins. Trade routes abandoned, loyalty fractured, and the very notion of central authority deeply compromised. Yet, what set Mehmed I apart was not just his ability to win battles, but his profound understanding that peace, legitimacy, and order would not come through the sword alone. They would require patience, forgiveness, institutional reform, and a powerful vision of unity that could appeal to a population worn thin by fear and exhaustion. His rule marked a conscious shift away from the unchecked bloodshed of the Interregnum toward an era of deliberate restoration. Recognizing that regional autonomy had grown dangerous during the years of civil war, Mehmed worked methodically to re-centralize power. This did not mean punishing every regional leader who had once served his brothers. Rather, it meant balancing justice with strategic tolerance. Those who pledged loyalty and showed competence were often retained, but they were now closely monitored through an improved provincial system that allowed the central court to maintain eyes and ears in distant regions. Key cities like Bursa, Edirne, and Amasya were reabsorbed into the core of imperial governance, serving as administrative hubs that ensured information, taxes, and justice flowed back to the throne. Alongside this territorial consolidation, Mehmed reformed the taxation system, which had all but collapsed during the wars. He knew that without reliable income, no military or bureaucracy could survive. Instead of raising taxes brutally on a weary population, he reintroduced order by regulating local tax collectors, reducing corruption, and reassuring citizens that their contributions served the greater cause of peace and unity. With state coffers gradually refilling, Mehmed turned his attention to rebuilding the Ottoman army, which had become a fragmented mess. The Janissaries had seen their reputation damaged by political manipulation, and the provincial cavalry known as the Sipahis had grown less disciplined. Mehmed introduced strict military codes and reasserted state control over troop deployments, preventing future power plays by ambitious generals. Rather than rushing back into foreign conquests to prove Ottoman strength, he wisely chose to use the army as a tool of internal stability and defense. It was a decision that bought the empire the breathing space it so desperately needed. At the same time, Mehmed understood the importance of legitimacy beyond the battlefield and palace. Religion had long been a tool of statecraft in the empire, but during the Interregnum, its authority had been undermined. Competing princes had promised religious groups various privileges in exchange for support, eroding the universal spiritual authority that once helped unify the realm. Mehmed reversed this by reaching out to prominent scholars, judges, and Sufi leaders to rebuild trust between the religious establishment and the Sultanate. He endowed madrasas to promote Islamic education, supported Waqf institutions to fund public services, and encouraged Sufi orders like the Bektashi and Mevlevi to act as agents of spiritual healing across the empire. This religious renewal not only reinforced his rule morally but also soothed a traumatized population. Under Mehmed's guidance, diplomacy also became a cornerstone of Ottoman policy. He did not rush to punish neighbors who had aided his rivals during the Interregnum. Instead, he approached foreign relations with careful calculation. The Byzantine Empire, for instance, had played both sides during the Civil War, but Mehmed avoided reckless retaliation. Instead, he maintained a tense but functional peace with Constantinople, understanding that stability on the Western Front was more valuable than a symbolic attack. He made similar moves with Venice and Hungary, issuing treaties and marriage alliances were needed to buy time and maintain equilibrium. Each diplomatic success, no matter how small, signaled to the world that the Ottomans were no longer a fractured family of warlords, but a rejuvenated empire under a wise and focused ruler. In the cultural realm, Mehmed I also began restoring the image of the Sultanate itself. The Ottoman court, which had been neglected and corrupted during the years of conflict, was reinvested with ceremony, structure, and purpose. Chroniclers were commissioned to document the era, often framing Mehmed as a God-sent savior who had rescued the empire from its darkest moment. Poets and historians compared him to Solomon for his wisdom, and his court became a gathering place for scholars, artists, and advisors who helped shape the narrative of rebirth. This emphasis on image and symbolism was critical in an age where perception held enormous weight in the hearts of subjects and the eyes of rivals. Still, the legacy Mehmed sought to build was not merely one of peaceful rule, it was one of preparation. He knew that he would not live to see the full fruits of his labor, and so he made sure to set the stage for a stronger, more enduring empire. His son, Murad II, was trained with a seriousness that reflected this vision. Mehmed ensured his son was exposed to court etiquette, religious discipline, military science, and administrative procedure. When Mehmed died in 1421, the transition of power to Murad was remarkably smooth compared to the horrors that had followed Bayezid's death. This was perhaps Mehmed's most subtle but profound success, a peaceful succession in a once broken empire. Murad II would go on to defend and expand the empire with force, and Mehmed II, his grandson, would eventually conquer Constantinople. But none of that history would have been possible without the quiet, relentless, and deeply strategic recovery overseen by Mehmed I. His reign stands as a rare moment in medieval imperial history where survival, not conquest, became the primary objective and where patience, wisdom, and unity triumphed over chaos, ambition, and revenge. Today, historians often refer to Mehmed I as the second founder of the Ottoman Empire, not because he built it from scratch, but because he rebuilt it when it had all but crumbled. He inherited not a throne, but a battlefield, and he died leaving behind a throne once more. His journey proves that leadership is not always about glory and expansion. It is sometimes about humility, sacrifice, and the slow, hard work of healing. And in Mehmed's case, that healing became the foundation upon which centuries of Ottoman strength were built.